We have in Cairo an unbroken sequence of inscriptions on major monuments from the 9th century onwards. And given the hundreds of monuments and thousands of inscriptions that have survived, this permits us to analyze them in a variety of ways, such as the visual aesthetics of texts, their relative lengths, the sizes of the scripts used, issues of legibility or the lack of it, and the exploration and makeup of the inscriptions from their textual contents to the non-literary usages that they served. Now, I'm assuming that most of you haven't visited Cairo, you're not that familiar with the city. It's bordered on the west by the Nile and on the east by a range of mountains which expand northwards as you go towards the east. And so the city started down here in a settlement that was originally made by the Romans and gradually expanded northwards. I'll just give some very, very brief summary of some of the main historical episodes as we go along. The slide changer doesn't seem to be working. I'm pressing the button, but it's not going. Okay, now we have it. Here's an excellent example of the importance of inscriptions in Cairo. You can see that part of the inscription here has been chiseled away. Now, this is on the front of a khanqa, kind of monastery for Sufis from the 14th century in Cairo. The Mamluk historian of 15th century one said that this is one in which the name of the founder, the Sultan, was missing. Now, in fact, the name of the founder, Ruknuddin Baybars, is still present after this. So what happened here? Well, Ruknuddin Baybars, he usurped the throne from a previous Muslim, Nasser Muhammad, but he made such a mess of his own sultanate that Nasser Muhammad was called back from exile and assassinated Ruknuddin Baybars, the founder of this monument. So what's missing here? Very likely the royal titles of Ruknuddin Baybars, the founder. And Nasser Muhammad couldn't wipe out his name from the building because it was a kind of legal document. It asserted the right of ownership and of the endowment of the building to the person who built it. But he could give the ultimate insult by wiping out his name from the facade of the building. Okay, sorry, that's why I was pressing the wrong button. That's why I wasn't going forward. I apologize. One major caveat in looking at the inscriptions on the monuments is that they don't look the same way today as they originally did. Originally, they were probably much more colorful. Almost all of the inscriptions would have had paint on them, which would have made them much easier to recognize. So the facade of that building had some major inscriptions. There's another inscription here, which is now fairly difficult to make out. But I'm going to show you a detail of the inscription that is inside one of these mausoleums. This is a 15th century building that was used as a theological college. And in very recent restoration of this building, they have uncovered original yellow or gold paint on tops of the letters with dark green in the background, which would have made them much easier to read originally. And in fact, in this same inscription that went around the courtyard, you have a detail of it here. When the same restoration people was looking at this in detail, they found traces of this same yellow paint on the letters with some green in the background, showing that it too would have had this very strong contrast of original colors and would have been much easier to read. Now, just as a demonstration of this, I can show you an example of some painted wooden decoration before restoration from a 13th century mausoleum in Cairo. And here is the same figure after restoration. You can see how the application of color makes the original design much more coherent. And so you need to keep this in mind when we're looking at the inscriptions on the monuments of Cairo. One of the earliest monuments from which we have a trace of an inscription is the Nylo Meter, which is a building that was used for measuring the height of the Nile. Very important because you could predict the amount of revenue that would come from crops and assign taxation accordingly. Now, in fact, we have a lot of historical information about this monument from the sources. It was built in 861 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutawakkil. And we're told that as well, the inscription that was originally on this wooden beam was painted in lapis lazuli background, a dark blue background with the letters in gold to make it more legible. So they were already conscious of this factor of paint enhancing the legibility of the inscriptions. It has Quranic inscriptions also, and we were told that there was discussion about how they were to be selected, another very interesting indication of the importance of decision-making in who had a say in what went on the monument. And in fact, in this case, the Quranic inscriptions were specifically picked for their relevance to the function of the monument. They give lots of verses mentioning God's bounty in giving water and rain to us, which causes crops to spring forth from the earth. In fact, the name of the founder, Al-Mutawakkil, is no longer present, probably because this is a contested inscription in which a later Abbasid governor of Cairo, Ibn Tulun, rebelled against Abbasid suzerainty, declared himself independent, and probably he didn't like to see the name of the previous Abbasid Caliph on this monument and instead substituted a Quranic inscription for it. The style of the inscription here is very plain still, and that applies to the inscriptions which are on the major monument that Ibn Tulun himself built in Cairo later in the 9th century. This is one of the finest early Islamic monuments that survive in the world today. It has very extensive Quranic inscriptions running along the beams just below the roof. It was originally thought that there was room for all of the Quran in this monument. In fact, probably about a third of the Quran would have fitted on it, still a substantial amount. And the letters in this is a detail, are still extremely plain, although of course they would have been originally painted. This is one of the foundation inscriptions of the monument that has survived. There were originally more, some of them are reproduced in the Description de l'Égypte, the book that Napoleon scholars wrote after they conquered Egypt in 1799. This is fairly small. This is actually on this screen just a little bit more than life size. Very different from the later monuments in which inscriptions are emblazoned across a portal. This is relatively modest still at this date. A major change occurs in inscriptions in the middle of the 9th century when they start, instead of being the plain letters that you saw, to have floral elements springing from the ends of the letters. This makes them much more decorative, and this is the style for many centuries from this point onwards. A major change comes with the arrival of the Fatimids in Cairo, a dynasty that started in North Africa. They conquered Cairo in 969 and ruled there for over a couple of hundred years, and founded a new city as well, Al-Qahira. It's the city from which we get the name Le Caire, Cairo. The various European derivations of the name come from this Fatimid city, which was built originally as an army camp with a main road running north-south between it and two palaces in the middle. And this is where, in fact, most of Cairo's medieval monuments are now to be found. One interesting development happened just before the Fatimids arrived in Cairo. This is a building from North Africa, from the town of Kairouan, which has an inscription on the outside of the building, the foundation inscription that gives the name of the founder and the date. This is the first example that we have of it in Islamic architecture. But it's a fashion that soon caught on in other parts of the Islamic world, including this major monument, the mosque of one of the early Fatimid caliphs, Al-Hakam, dating from the beginning of the 11th century. It's a monument that has been recently restored. This is a model of how it originally looked at. We're going to look at some details of the minarets in particular, which are very interesting. It had more than one tower to begin with, which is unusual at this date. Also, the towers were in tiers of different shapes, a square followed by a cylinder, a taller square followed by an octagon. The only other place in the Islamic world at this date which had more than one minaret and minarets of different tiers of different shapes was in the holy cities in Mecca and Medina. And this is a reconstruction of how the minaret originally looked like. with the foundation inscription in the name of Al-Hakam in very prominent Kufic letters. Here's a detail of one now. It's a very awkward angle for the photograph, and you might wonder why this is so. In fact, this is so because, just to go back, Al-Hakam at a later stage ordered bastions, large square towers, to be built in front of the minarets, which look like this. Why was this? Well, there's still some controversy about this, but the best guess probably is that at the time these bastions were ordered to be made in 1010, Al-Hakam had just lost control of the holy cities. There was a rebellion in Palestine which was supported by the governors of Mecca and Medina. And so the shame was so great. In fact, the pilgrimage wasn't even sent from Cairo to the holy cities in those years, that in order to cover up this visual reference to the minarets of the holy cities, he ordered these square bastions to be built in front of the minarets. It's a wonderful demonstration of the symbolic power of architecture. And instead, just these Quranic inscriptions were made on top of the bastions in front. This is the same mosque that we were looking at, the Mosque of Al-Hakam, and in front of it you have the wonderful gates that were built later in the reign of one of the succeeding caliphs, Al-Mustansir, in 1075, some of the best military architecture of that period around the Mediterranean. There's a foundation inscription beside this tower, Bab al-Futuh, which is in the name of the founder, and as I said, at this stage, they started decorating inscriptions by having floral forms growing out of it. And some of the finest floral forms are selected particularly for the name of the caliph, the founder, Al-Mustansir, which has these wonderful double leaf forms growing out of it. He also was responsible for adding a mihrab to a pier in the Mosque of Ibn Tulun that we just looked at as well. And here too, the place at which the eye first rests in the top right-hand corner, that's the place where the name of the same caliph, Al-Mustansir, appears. Also from the Fatimid period, but a little bit later, 1125, is this small neighborhood mosque in the center of Cairo, the Mosque of Al-Akmar. And this is the first that had a foundation inscription that went all along the top of the facade, and actually one that was also repeated along the middle of the facade, a great way to advertise the generosity, the munificence of the patron of the building. And in the middle, this is a detail of this little medallion that's above the entrance door. We also have this wonderfully carved stone medallion, which has a Quranic inscription, although at this stage, it's in a complete circle, so just how you read that upside down is a little bit tricky. In fact, many Muslims would have memorized the Quran, so if you got the beginning of it, you would be able to know how it ended. But they haven't gone to the trouble of writing it out completely in advance at this stage, because you see they've had to squeeze the last letter on top of a word in the line below it. There's another circular inscription at the top of this building as well. It's one actually which is almost impossible to read from the ground. I think until this was photographed recently with a telephoto lens, it probably wasn't read from the time it was erected. But in this case, it actually is another one that gives the name of the founder of the building and the reigning caliph at the time. Another change comes at the end of the Fatimid period with a change in script. All of the scripts that we've been looking at this kind have been in one that is called Kufic, which some of my Turkish colleagues in the audience might know, others of you may not. It's one that has a constant bass line. But now in this, which is a cenotaph that was originally made for the shrine of the head of Hussein, a very important Shi'i martyr, and that probably dates from the end of the Fatimid period. It's now in the museum in Cairo. They start, in addition to the Kufic, the script with the constant bass line that we had before, they use also very extensively another more cursive script called Naskh, and this becomes mainly standard from this point onwards. Now, At this point, another dynasty comes to power in Cairo. Saladin is probably a name that you're familiar with, the great Muslim fighter against the Crusaders. He founded the Yuba dynasty in Cairo, which was responsible for building the citadel here in the southeast. And this formed a kind of magnet between the old Fatimid city up here and the earlier mosque of Ibn Tulun as well. This was in about 1175 when the Ayyubids started. This is one of their most early imported monuments, the mausoleum of Imam Shafi, one of the founders of the 4 legal rights in Islam. And the Ayyubids wanted to counter Fatimid religious propaganda by building a madrasa, theological college in this spot. And one of the first ways in which they honored this jurist was by the construction of a wooden cenotaph over his grave, which was donated by Saladin himself. And this is another one which also combines this earlier Kufic script in the bottom of the cenotaph with wonderful inlaid geometric patterning with the use of some cursive script in the upper part. And that's another detail of it at the end, which also gives the foundation inscription with the name of a craftsman actually who came from Aleppo in northern Syria to work on this. There's also a foundation inscription in the name of Salah ad-Din that was found recently by the wall that was made for the Al-Azhar Park, a new foundation that the Aga Khan patronized in Cairo. And this is in the older script Kufic. There were some earlier scholarly arguments that Kufic in fact was superseded by the cursive script as an ideological sign of anti-Fatimid propaganda, but clearly this shows that this was not the case. So the Ayyubids in turn didn't last terribly long. They were succeeded by the Mamluks. The word means owned. They were originally the slave troops, the mercenaries of the Ayyubids. They were imported from Central Asia or the area around the Caspian Sea. They were Turks who were brought up as slaves but then manumitted, in other words given their freedom, brought up as Muslims, and they didn't have a fixed method of succession. When one of them died, they had to see who formed the most emirs who were his friends. Doesn't sound like a very good recipe for success. In fact, they lasted for 250 years and were one of the most successful Muslim dynasties. And one of the most impressive early Mamluk complexes is one built by a sultan called Qalun in 1283, consisting of a hospital, a madrasa, a theological college, and this is his mausoleum with the minaret on the right-hand side. It has a very striking different kind of facade with these indented windows, but also very important is the foundation inscription that goes all the way along the facade. It's much taller than previous examples. It's also much lower to the ground and would have been much more easy to read for that point of view. What does it contain? Not a Quranic inscription, but in fact, it has a foundation inscription giving the name and titles of Qalun. This is how it looks in Arabic. This is the translation into English, and it has these wonderful ringing titles: King of Kings of the Arabs and the non-Arabs, possessor of the 2 Qiblas, custodian of the 2 holy shrines, Sultan of Islam and the Muslims, the reviver of justice in the world, giving victory to the truth with proofs, etc. A wonderful endorsement of his power and of his generosity also in giving this monument to his subjects. People were actually treated free in the hospital that was part of this complex. The slight miscalculation, though, if I just go back to the entrance, which is right here, the detail that I'm showing in this photograph is of this part, and that's actually where the name of Qalun occurs in the inscription. They didn't quite get the spacing right there, possibly, to make it in the most prominent place. This is another Mamluk mosque and madrasa dating from the middle of the 14th century, that of Aslam Salah Dar. And I'm going to be showing you some details of the entrance inscriptions here, and also of one that is in the mausoleum that is attached to the complex. Now, there's an inscription right at the base of this very tall, narrow dome, one which in fact is almost impossible to read from the ground. And so when the restorers were working on this, they made a plaster cast of the inscription here so that in fact you would eventually be able to read it. So what's the point of having an inscription that no one can actually see? Well, most of these inscriptions are normally Quranic. So in fact they have a way of sanctifying the building in which they're placed. They make it more holy, in fact, even if you can't read it from the ground. This also has some wonderful other inscriptions apart from marvelous inlaid stone decoration. There's actually a foundation inscription here, detailed there, which means that this inscription down below is one which is Quranic. And unlike most Mamluk inscriptions, which are relatively plain, this has some wonderful incised decorations in the letters. And there's another portal in this monument as well, just around the corner of the monument. I'm going to show you a detail of this inscription. For some reason, the patron is unusually interested in the detail of scripts. Like many of those in contemporary Turkey, for instance, or in Seljuk Turkey, there are wonderful rounded forms for the letters, looking as if they've been squeezed from a toothpaste tube, with little floral details, and then a lovely floriated scroll in the background as well. This is the single most famous monument in Cairo, possibly the largest Mamluk monument, the complex of Sultan Hassan, built in the middle of the 14th century, consisting of a Friday mosque, 4 madrasas, a mausoleum. And we're looking at a detail of the Qibla Ewin, one of the largest Ewins built in the Islamic world. It has a very interesting inscription running all the way through it in an unusual style. It's back to Kufic, the earlier archaic style that we had in the very beginning of the days of Islam. And also it has these kind of triangular forms on the letters, which is unusual for Kufic. The place where you find this most often is in manuscripts. But before we get to that, I'm just going to show you a detail of this, because it has the name of the supervisor of the works of this monument, and also of the calligrapher Muhsin ibn Bilik was his name. And very interestingly, he was also responsible for calligraphing a Quran. So this was a very unusual Mamluk Emir who was very skilled in calligraphy. The Quran has the same kind of Kufic script that we saw in the Iwan, and exceptionally he seems to be the person who designed the inscriptions for this monument as well. And in fact, even some of the decoration in the monument, such as this teardrop-shaped medallion at the entrance, is very similar to what you find in contemporary manuscript illumination as well. This is a detail of the interior of the mausoleum. You see the difference here between the restored inscription and the unrestored part, which is much harder to read. They have repainted the restored version here. And slightly later building than this, from the late 14th century, the complex of Sultan Barakuk is one which emulates Sultan Hassan in many ways. It has a projecting portal. Here, it's actually just up the road from the complex of Qibla Ewin that we looked at earlier, the one which had the very long foundation inscription on the facade. This has one too, a little bit higher up. Here, they were more careful, in fact, to get the name of the founder, Barakuk, in the most important point at the top right of the portal, where the eye would normally rest. Since the foundation inscription is up here, that means further down you can have a much more decorative Quranic inscription, and this, in fact, with its braided uprights, is one of the most delicate and beautifully designed inscriptions in Cairo. And in fact, we can look at inscriptions from different points of view, from the aesthetic point of view as well. In some of these later examples, this is an early 16th century one. I'm going to show you a detail of this area here. We now return to another form of Kufic, in which you have marble which is inlaid with bitumen, a kind of tar, in other words. And this is a purely decorative form of Kufic. It's one, in fact, which was also continued on into the early Ottoman period in Cairo. This is a mosque in the citadel in Cairo dating from the early part of the 16th century. Another very decorative form of script is one that is called square Kufic, in which all of the letters are at right angles to one another, making it very difficult to read, of course, because it's easy to mix up the letter forms in this way. So it's usually reserved for something that's very easy to read, like the word Muhammad. This is Muhammad here, 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 and here. So you have it 4 times here, and that's repeated in each of these. And you have the same form here in different colors. This, in fact, is a detail from the mausoleum of the complex of Sultan Qibla Ewin that we looked at a little bit earlier. Or a wonderful example of Ottoman design, which has the name of the Prophet Muhammad and his 12 companions who were promised paradise from an 18th century restoration of the Mosque of Al-Azhar. This is now in the Museum of Islamic Art, and it's a superb example of design. An unusual example for Cairo is a little hexagon which appears in a couple of monuments. The hexagon has in the middle of it something that looks purely like a bit of geometric design to begin with, but in fact it's the name Ali, the name of the 4th caliph, but one which is particularly honored, of course, by the Shia, although it occurs in this case on 2 Sunni monuments. And it's also very common, in fact, in tilework in Iran. This, in fact, is a drawing for tilework which is actually present on a scroll in the Topkapi Saray Museum in Istanbul, dating from roughly around the same period. We can also study the inscriptions in Cairo from terms of their content. We've been looking at Quranic and foundation inscriptions now for the most part. From this same monument, the complex of Al-Ghori in the late early 16th century, there are inscriptions over the doors that have extracts from the Burda, which is a poem written by a Mamluk author in the middle of the 14th century in praise of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's quite popular in many examples of domestic architecture in Cairo as well. Or in this building from the early 15th century, of a Mamluk sultan, this very large inscription that runs all the way through the building is a waqfiyya, in other words, the contents of the endowment deed of the building, telling us in great detail which properties were bequeathed to it and which would have produced revenue for the building. Or this is a unique example in Cairo. This is one dating from the 18th century. It's from the tomb of Abdurrahman Kadhuda, added to the Mosque of Al-Azhar, which gives a description of the physical properties of the Prophet. It's one that's very unusual to find in stone. The most common examples of it are in Ottoman calligraphic panels. A hilya is the name of it. And the final example of a type of inscription is seen on the Mausoleum of Hadan Sadaqa, a 14th century mausoleum in Cairo, which contains an extract from the Maqamat of Al-Hariri. This is a secular work that was celebrated for the trickster who managed to extort money from people by his eloquence, although in fact it does also contain some very, very eloquent passages in praise of God, and this is what we see here. So let me just summarize some of the points that I've been making. Inscriptions obviously mattered very much in medieval Cairo. They could convey information in many ways, directly by their content, indirectly as indicators of prestige, or even as assurances that God's word was being proclaimed from on high. Leaving behind a building for one's fellow Muslims after one's death was one of the surest ways to earn spiritual benefit. And the inscriptions on them announced the generosity of the patron, proclaiming his name and royal titles, and they ensured that the endowments that he set up for the building would be honoured. Another way of attracting attention to them would have been through their colours, which brings me back to the caveat that I started this talk with, namely that evaluations of what was legible and what are not are risky on the basis of today's evidence, given the lack of these painted colours that would have affected so many inscriptions on carved stone. But even today, they provide a feast for the eye, so we can be sure that their original impact was much greater. Thank you.